In the last section, we put together a little application over here in CodePen. And when you move your mouse around inside the app, you get this nice little visualization. Now the app looks pretty cool, but at the same time, we had to write out a ton of code here with some pretty complicated syntax. So I'm sure at this point, you might have a couple of different questions about what we put together. So in this video, I want to start to address a couple of these questions that I think you might or might not have. The first question I want to address is the one that I just said was really boring. Remember, I just said these questions over here are kind of boring. Well, not really. I was just being facetious. Let's start by answering this question. What is React and what is its purpose? What do we use this library for? Okay, so what is the purpose of React? React by itself is a single JavaScript library. The goal of React is to produce some usable content that is going to show up on the screen of your user's browser. When we say content, what we're really talking about here is HTML, the same type of HTML that you've probably learned by this point. So divs and spans, buttons, forms, headers, all those classic HTML elements are going to be produced by the React library, and then they're going to show up on the screen of your user's browser. Once those elements show up on the screen, a user is going to somehow interact with them. So they might click on a button. They might type some input into a text input, or they might drag and drop some div or something around on the screen. The second goal of React is to handle those user interactions. So anytime that a user manipulates our app in some fashion, we want to respond to that in some way. Now we'll talk a lot more about what React is and what its purpose is over time, but for right now, this definition will hold up for what we need. All right, let's move on to our next question. So why didn't we use Redux to make that application? Just to be clear, we didn't use Redux. The only library that we used there was React. In truth, we can build the most complicated applications you can imagine using just the React library by itself. However, very frequently, when we are making more complicated applications, rather than writing out a ton of code from scratch to suit the purpose of our application, we'll frequently pull in third-party packages or other JavaScript libraries just to make our application development go a little bit faster and a little bit easier. So React can totally work by itself. We can make the most complicated app you can imagine, but at the same time, it can also work with so many other libraries, packages, databases, servers, just about anything you can imagine. And throughout this course, we're going to see exactly how we can get React to work with those other pieces of software. All right, next question. What was that class thing that we put together? If you notice back over here in the JavaScript editor, around line 7 or so, for me at least, we had this class app extends react.component. So that syntax we saw there, that thing was a JavaScript class. JavaScript classes are part of what is referred to as ES 2015. ES 2015 is a spec that contains a couple of different changes to the JavaScript language. If you are not familiar with JavaScript classes, or if you're not familiar with syntax like this right here, arrow functions, or instance properties or class properties, that's totally fine. We're going to talk about all these more advanced pieces of ES 2015 syntax throughout this course nonstop. Now, the class itself was creating something called a React component. A component is one of the most basic pieces of React, and in this course, we're going to build a tremendous number of different components. The ultimate goal of a single component is essentially the goal of the React library itself. A single component is going to be used to create some amount of HTML, have that HTML show up on the screen, and then somehow react to user input. We can create React components using either JavaScript classes, which is what we just used, or JavaScript functions, like the same functions that you're probably already used to putting together. We'll talk about the difference between JavaScript functions and classes being used for components quite a bit over time. So for right now, let's just kind of leave this question as it stands. All right, next question. What was that HTML looking stuff? Back inside of the editor over here, you'll notice that inside of that render method, we had what looked like a little bit of HTML right here. So in fact, that was not quite HTML, even though it looks very much like HTML. Instead, what we wrote there was something called JSX. JSX is a special dialect of JavaScript that essentially allows us to tell a React component how it should look like when it's rendered and shows up on the screen of the browser. So that JSX is used to determine the content of our React application, just like normal HTML does. In general, if you are familiar with HTML, you're going to do just fine with JSX. All of the syntax is almost identical. but we'll learn about a couple of corner cases with JSX over time, and also learn a little bit more about exactly what JSX is. All right, so long section here, but just one or two more questions. So the next question, how did we get the screen to change when we move the mouse? Well, remember, kind of the running theme here is that we make use of React to handle user interaction. So as we just spoke about with components, just a second ago, we spoke about components over here. Where was it? Right here. We had said that a component is used to present some content on the screen. We can also use a component to create something called an event handler. Event handlers are used to somehow detect when a user is interacting with our app by clicking or dragging or typing or whatever it might be. We can then use that event handler to somehow update our application or update our component and show some slightly different content on the screen. We're going to write a tremendous number of event handlers throughout this course because this is one of the absolute primary goals of the React library, responding to user interaction. All right, last question. Here we go. This one might be the most interesting. Why did we add two separate libraries? Remember, when we went through that initial setup, we clicked on the settings button up here. We then clicked on JavaScript, and we added two separate libraries. One was called React, and the other was called React DOM. So the React library by itself contains a ton of JavaScript code that defines what a component is and how different components work together. In a typical React application, we're going to end up making multiple different components and somehow getting them to join up together to form an actual usable application. The React library itself is in charge of making that entire process work. On the other hand, the React DOM library contains some amount of JavaScript code that will take that collection of components and eventually get them to show up inside of the DOM, or get them to show up as some HTML. So that's why we added two separate libraries. If you ever go and start to learn about React Native, which is the library used to create mobile applications, you'll notice a similar split over there as well. We have one library that contains definitions of what components are, and then a separate library to actually get those components to show up on the screen of a mobile device, as opposed to a browser. All right, so that's a couple of questions that we just answered. Quite a bit to go through in the first two videos here. So let's take a quick pause right now. We're going to come back to the next section and start learning more about React.